One of the recommendations is very similar to what I had just described, right? Of changing and tweaking our design guidelines and constraints, zoning regulations, and even our permitting process to make building different types of housing easier. We want to see more of that missing middle housing, even though currently a lot of it, what you see in town, is very expensive because it was still difficult for them to get past the entitlement process, and you got to make up that money somehow, and it's going to be the people that are buying it. One of the more, I would say, contentious, because again, this is one of the recommendations that sort of spurred this discussion in the first place, is an inclusionary zoning ordinance. And the thought behind that is, how do we pay for affordable housing in a way that doesn't shift the cost burden to existing residents? And by mandating developers to provide a certain percentage of their unit count as affordable based off of certain percentages of area median incomes and such, that it shifts the cost burden to anyone who is moving into that neighborhood in particular, right? Because that would be where the developer is going to make their money back into the rest of the units in that development. So it's attractive in that regard, but it's not a squeaky clean policy, because it requires enforcement. You know, you need to make sure that those deed restricted properties are actually being sold and rented at the prices they're supposed to be. You have to keep track of what those price points are supposed to be using market analyses and area media incomes. And it's difficult, but it can be an effective tool. We also recommend an alternative, if that's not quite palatable to the town council, to consider having a similar mandate baked into our annexation policies. So if they're not ready to go full tilt on all developments in the town having that requirement, maybe have it for any annexation with a residential component, that they need to offer something to a similar degree of, say, around 15%. One of our other options that we consider that has an expense related to them is exploring the use of payment in lieu of taxes or pilot projects to incentivize developers to create more ambitious housing options that might not have that immediate return that selling these luxury single-family homes would. Then the mindset behind that approach is that you are foregoing some tax revenue in the beginning, which is a loss for the town because we're providing services without getting the tax revenue. But from an opportunity cost standpoint, if that land was otherwise undeveloped, the hope is that over that 10 to 15 year period, you are now going to have a development in the future that is making that money back. Beyond that, we also recommend a pilot in a different sense, not the acronym, but a pilot project using some form of public land, whether it is a county-owned piece of property or a town-owned piece of property, or likely one of those two, unless we find a very generous benefactor. But the hope is that by being the landowner in this situation, the town can really cut a huge cost component of what makes living so expensive, and it's the land beneath it, right? As part of this pilot project, we would want to work with a developer, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit, that is willing to experiment with different housing types. We would work with the Planning Commission and the Town Council to have very flexible zoning approaches as it relates to dimensional constraints and such, to really see what's possible when you remove those constraints, and hopefully have that project inform some of our other zoning changes. If we realize that we can make really beautiful spaces that have a diversity of housing types at an affordable rate, then maybe whatever zoning changes need to be enacted to make that kind of thing possible, we can continue with. And we also we hope it'll help break the stigma around what's considered affordable housing, in that in reality, it's a home that's affordable. Yeah. And it can take a lot of different shapes. It can be an apartment complex, it could be a condo, it could be a townhome, it can even be a single family home in some cases. It just depends on how it's built and at what densities that make it viable for someone to actually put the money into that. You got to show people something to make them believe in it. More broadly, we have a recommendation of a community outreach and education campaign. Ideally using a standalone website that is tied to the town's website, of course, that is serving two functions. One is to, again, help provide clarity on what affordable housing means, who it's serving, and sort of demystify what that means, right? It's not this idea of project housing or slums or something that people might jump to when they hear about this. It's folks that you're already seeing every day that you're either working with or that you're buying goods and services from a person across from you that deserves a place to live. So our last recommendation is to the Affordable Housing Board to recommend they use their existing funds. So this wouldn't be requiring any additional taxes levied or anything like that. This is whenever a contribution is made to the Affordable Housing Fund, the board decides how it's being used. We recommend that they divert or to prioritize their use of funds on the rehabilitation of existing housing stock here in town. Because it's a component of housing scarcity that is not often talked about. That it's not just about how many houses you're building, it's about how many houses you're stopping from not being livable. And especially if we're going to push infill development and redevelopment of areas, we want to make sure we are not displacing folks who already live in town. And so by providing cost assistance to folks who might be facing those kinds of pressures to sell their property and move somewhere else, you have to give them the ability to rehabilitate those properties in a way that they can continue to live there.